Good morning. It is Wednesday, the 25th of February. I'm Maeve McMahon and this is Europe Today. That's your daily dose of European news and analysis live here on Euronews. Coming up, while you were sleeping, US President Donald Trump delivered his annual State of the Union speech. Heavily focused on the economy, it also touched on immigration, Iran, tariffs and NATO defence spending. It comes as a fresh CNN poll says 32% of Americans do not think Trump has his priorities right, and 68% say he has not addressed the country's most important problems. For more, we're joined here on set by our EU News editor, Maria Tadeo. Good morning.
Good morning.
Look, this is a real American tradition, right? The State of the Union, but Europeans are keeping a very close eye.
Well, Maeve, they have to, and yes, you're right. This is a very American politics event. Of course, this is really about the President of the United States setting out his vision, and of course, the timing matters too, because we're halfway through the Trump presidency, the midterms are coming up, and obviously, the President Trump, he has to sell his project to the American people, and also hope for a sort of a reset too, because as you alluded to with polls and his approval rate, you can really see that the cost of living in the U.S., the idea of grocery prices, all of this is really biting into the popularity of the U.S. president. And there's perception that perhaps he spent too much time focused on external politics and the geopolitics for a president who promised to put America first. But nonetheless, yes, Europeans obviously follow and they monitor pretty much every speech because, and I think on this we can agree, this is a president who is unpredictable. So when you look at the speech yesterday, a lot of that focused on the U.S. He talked about migration, the idea that illegal arrivals now into the U.S. through the southern border with Mexico have dramatically collapsed. And of course, that is factual because of this very hardline policy that he's pursued. He talked about a border in a country that is now sealed. He also talked about the economy, the stock market, which is an index that he really likes to track and monitor. The question is whether that reflects to the economy of everyday Americans. But from a European perspective, this was really a policy speech in which they did not get a lot of clues in terms of where the foreign policy of the U.S. is going, because there was barely no mention of Ukraine. There was only a very brief but also in passing when it comes to NATO, which he said now our allies pay for that protection and they gotta pay. He also said everything that we send to Ukraine we now do through NATO, and that is through a mechanism in which the Europeans pay. So the U.S. is no longer paying for this. And then he mentioned Iran, and that is relevant, of course, in the context of this military ramp-up that we've seen from the U.S. in the region, saying, quote, the preference is to find a diplomatic solution, but Iran has to pronounce the magic words, and that is they will never get a nuclear weapon. In any case, he said the U.S. will not allow it. Interestingly, of course, there was a lot of concern. Perhaps the Greenland may come up or could come up, and it was not the case. So overall, yes, a speech dedicated to U.S. policy that mostly centered on U.S. policy.
But what about tariffs?
Well, that's a very good question because he did mention the tariffs. He said and vindicated the tariff policy. We know that this is a sort of doctrine that Donald Trump has pursued, certainly on an intellectual level, this idea that tariffs are needed and the U.S. should have implemented that for decades now. He did say the tariffs are working and this is a policy that is going to stay. It is relevant, of course, because the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the tariffs that were approved last year connected to Liberation Day, saying they were designed in a way that was illegal. Nonetheless, Donald Trump insisted tariffs, one way or another, will stay in place. Let's take a look.
One of the primary reasons for our country's stunning economic turnaround were tariffs. They were ripping us so badly, you all know that. Everybody knows it. Even the Democrats know it. They just don't want to say it. Then just 4 days ago, an unfortunate ruling from the United States Supreme Court. It just came down. It came down. Very unfortunate ruling. So despite the disappointing ruling, these powerful, country-saving will remain in place under fully approved and tested alternative legal statutes.
And that's, of course, Donald Trump. Maeve, the catch, however, he talks about totally safe, totally tested, and totally legal tariffs. The issue, of course, is last year when he implemented the Liberation Day tariffs, the reciprocal, quote-unquote, tariffs. He also said they were illegal. The Supreme Court had a very different opinion. For the Europeans, however, this is critical because a deal was agreed last year. A bad deal tilted in favor of the U.S. Of course, 15% tariff rate. The Europeans say that in this chaos around global trade, they do do not want to end up in a situation in which they pay more. They agree that a deal is a deal and that 15% really is the top, the ceiling. The concern, of course, is that the U.S. will now implement other tariffs. When you add up the tally, European companies could end up having to pay more. And that is something that both the Commission and also the Trade Commissioner, who had a call with the G7 too and has been in contact with the U.S., had said the EU simply cannot accept. A deal is a deal. That 15% was already high and bad enough. Tariffs tripled. It cannot go beyond that.
As you say, tariffs causing a lot of stress here in Brussels. Maria Tadeo, your News' EU editor, thank you so much for all those details. And to dive a little deeper, coming up, we'll be joined by the Irish politician and MEP Barry Andrews, a member of the centre-right Fianna Fáil party, the party of the Irish Taoiseach Micheál Martin. Barry Andrews is a former government minister and a barrister by trade. Barry Andrews, welcome to Europe Today. Thank you so much for joining us. Did you manage to watch the State of the Union speech? What did you think of it from a European lens?
Well, it was 2 hours long. Apparently, it was the longest in recent history. So, no is the answer. I didn't see all of it, but I obviously watched extracts. I mean, I think part of it that everybody's very concerned about is Iran. And while he didn't really disengage or de-escalate, he did say that they are in negotiations. So that's positive. That's something we're all very pleased to hear about. But he rambled a lot, and there was a lot of fact checkers kept very busy during the 2 hours about his claims about the economy and how tariffs are impacting the economy. And I think there's a lot of dispute about the actual impact of tariffs on the US economy.
Tariffs is a very sensitive issue also for lawmakers here in Brussels. And we know the EU-US trade deal, it's on hold for now, but the European Commission is putting a lot of pressure on you, on the Parliament, to pass it through. What's your view here?
Well, we're not the only ones that are not proceeding with trade agreements with the US. India was supposed to be in Washington this week to finalise a trade agreement. Japan, Taiwan, there are many others that are now slow-walking effectively the trade agreements that they had with the United States. So I think it's impossible for us to do this in circumstances where nobody is sure whether the new tariffs themselves are legal. They are going to be subject to legal scrutiny. I've no doubt about that. And we're not even sure whether or not there will be refunds for the former tariffs. So there's so much uncertainty. And ultimately, it's consumers and businesses that pay the cost for this uncertainty. So it's much more prudent, in my view, for us to wait until that legal certainty is provided.
And just moving on to Ukraine, we saw yesterday Ursula von der Leyen showing up a little bit empty-handed because that €90 billion loan is on hold. She said there's other options, though. What other options?
Look, there are multiple options available. There's intergovernmental approaches. There could be an enhanced cooperation approach. There could be something around a coalition of the willing. But ultimately, the sensitivity here, of course, as everybody knows, is that there's an election in Hungary in April. And the last thing the European Commission wants to do is to walk into the trap set by Orban. Orban would love to fight this election with Europe breathing down his neck, with forcing him, strong-arming Orban to do something he really doesn't want to do. We can't get into that. So we have to find a way that excludes Hungary. I'm not exactly sure what those options are going to be, but ultimately we have to provide this €90 billion loan to Ukraine. By April, they will run out of money. So it is absolutely existential for the future of Ukraine.
Another issue, of course, EU membership for Ukraine. President Zelensky pushing for a date, but Commission President saying we cannot give a date. What's your view here? Should they join by 2027, Barry?
Absolutely. I think it's one of the key motivations for Ukrainians to maintain their resilience. I was there in November. We went over to Kharkiv with a demining charity, Halo Trust, and everybody that visits is just blown away by how amazing they are, how resilient they are, how tough they are. But one of the things that really motivates, I find, is that there is a road, a pathway to accession in the near term. And so long as that is still there and very much a reality for Ukrainians, I think they will be able to continue to pursue the war against Russia.
OK, Barry Andrews, thank you so much for coming into us this morning and being our guest here on Europe Today. And just yesterday, speaking in Kiev, the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, as I said it would not be possible to put a date on Ukraine's EU membership. Speaking alongside President Zelensky on the anniversary of the 4 years since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the Commission President also promised a solution would be found to bridge the country's financing needs. For more, we can dive a little deeper with our Ukraine correspondent, Sasha Vakalina, who joins us here on set. Good morning. So look, this idea of there's no date we can put on the table. That's what the Commission President said. But, Ukraine wants to join by 2027.
No, that statement was indeed a cold shower. Also because, of course, that happened on the 4th anniversary when the EU leaders were there to show and prove their support for Ukraine. Now, let's take a little step back. Now, for Ukraine, the EU membership is something that Ukrainians have been seeking not now since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but since 2014, since Russia's first invasion. These were the demonstrations over the revolution of dignity. So this is something important. Now Kyiv feels like, on one hand, first of all, this is something that the European Union promised Ukraine and committed to it with the beginning of the full-scale invasion, but also Ukraine sees this, and this is what's been negotiated here, as part of the EU security guarantees. And should there be a chance to put an end to Russia's all-out war against Ukraine this year, how can we proceed in this case for Ukrainians towards the end of the war with the EU guarantees for Ukraine, which include EU membership? Let's take a listen to what happened yesterday in Kyiv.
For Ukraine's accession to the EU, the year 2027 is very important for us, and I hope doable. I hope so that Putin cannot block our membership for decades.
I understand very well that for you a clear date is also important. The date you set is your benchmark that you want to match. You know that from our side, dates by themselves are not possible.
Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and President Zelensky there. And meanwhile, of course, Sasha, the 90 billion euro loan is also on hold for Ukraine. Another awkward point in that meeting.
Absolutely. So no timeline, no commitment to the timeline, and also now the loan being blocked. Also, given the fact that the loan was already agreed upon in December, and that was such an important decision. Now, Brussels said that they're going to try to find the plan B, but this is not even the plan B, Maeve. Now, at this stage, we're much further than that. And this is when the President of the Commission said that the word cannot be broken, but looks like it can be blocked. Let's take a listen to what she had to say.
We call it the steel porcupine loan because it should give Ukraine the strength of a steel porcupine, indigestible potential invaders. We will deliver on the loan, one way or the other. Let me be very clear, we have different options and we will use them.
What are those options? Now, this is indeed 90 billion euros question, because the EU seemed to have discussed and explored all of those options in December, and that was the only one that they managed to agree upon, the one that is now blocked.
It is indeed. Sasha Vakalina, thank you so much for that update, as always. And now, as we have been reporting here all week on Euronews, Ukraine, Hungary and Slovakia are in the midst of a serious spat over a key pipeline that supplies Russian crude to Central Europe. In case you hadn't heard of the Druzhba pipeline before this week, here's our Jakub Janis with a refresher.
In the 1960s, the Soviet Union built one of the longest oil pipelines in the world to supply its satellite states. It was called Druzhba, which translates to friendship. And right now, that friendship pipeline is tearing Europe apart. Let's look at it from the start, shall we? A month ago, an incident was reported on the pipeline, impacting flows of cheap Russian oil going to Hungary and Slovakia through Ukraine. Kyiv blamed ongoing Russian strikes for the blaze, saying the constant pounding from the air is delaying repair works. But Budapest and Bratislava accused Ukraine of lying. And last Wednesday, they retaliated by halting their own diesel exports to Ukraine until the pipeline is restored. 2 days later, Viktor Orban said it would block a crucial 90 billion euro emergency loan for Ukraine. And with Russian attacks devastating its internal power generation, Kyiv relies heavily on imported electricity to survive the winter. And almost half of these imports come directly from Hungary, and Slovakia is another important supplier. Then, on Monday, Ukrainian forces struck a key Russian pumping station feeding that Druzhba pipeline, aiming to bleed Moscow of petrodollars. In response, Slovakia and Hungary demanded the EU investigate if Kyiv lied about original damage and completely halted emergency electricity to Ukraine. Which finally brings us to today. The European Commission is holding an emergency meeting with Hungary, Slovakia and Croatia to try to find alternative oil routes. But with Croatia refusing to transport Russian oil, it seems the EU diplomatic pipeline is completely blocked.
Jakob Yanis reporting there. And for more analysis, we're now joined once again here on set by our Maria Tadeo to tell us why, Maria, is this pipeline sending politics ablaze?
Well, Maeve, this is now a mess. Really, this is a very messy situation. It is almost approaching what I would say is an institutional crisis when it comes to the EU, because obviously there's now a full-on clash between Hungary, to a lesser extent Slovakia, but also the rest of member states who want to facilitate help to Ukraine. At the same time, this is a question that goes beyond the politics. It is also very technical because, as you saw there is a question of a pipeline, this Druzhba pipeline, which connects, just to set the scene for our viewers, Russia with Hungary. It transports cheap Russian oil, but it goes through Ukraine. This pipeline was, and this is objective, it's a fact, it was damaged at the end of January. There was an issue, of course, and this is a matter of the crux of this story, which is, was it a Russian strike, or this is just a case in which Ukraine has neglected the reparations so that oil doesn't transit? And this is the line that the Hungarian government is pushing. And I reported extensively on this this week. On Monday, there was a meeting of foreign ministers and it got very heated. I was told by a number of sources that the Hungarian minister told his Ukrainian counterpart, who was connected in this meeting through a conference call, that he was, quote, a liar. He also snapped at Kaja Kallas, who is a top European diplomat, saying, you give a non-EU member state more time than you are giving me to reply. I cannot talk to him directly. And also, I will not allow at this point that Ukraine criticizes Hungary. Obviously, this is also very political because there is a very brutal, aggressive election campaign going on in Hungary. And this question now has become, for Prime Minister Viktor Orban, not just a talking point on the campaign, but really a matter of national sovereignty. At this point, however, and this is a critical question, is who damaged the pipeline and who's going to fix it? And that was a question that was put yesterday to President Zelensky in a press conference in Kyiv, and he doubled down. This is not about Ukraine. It was Russia. Let's take a look.
Pipeline was destroyed by Russia. We have images. We have everything by satellites of partners. So Russia destroyed these pipelines several times.
And that was a Ukrainian, of course, president saying this is not the first time, and this pipeline has been damaged by Russia. Now, at this stage, what are the solutions? What does a possible compromise look like? Well, there's the idea that an inspection could be carried out externally, but of course, for Ukraine, that is delicate because you're talking about a war zone. A different number of pipelines have been floated, perhaps as providing another way to flow the Russian oil into Hungary. But of course, the rest of European countries say they do not want to transit Russian oil because they want to unplug from Russian energy. And of course, at this stage, the Hungarians really control whether the money gets to Ukraine and whether the sanctions package goes ahead. This is a great talking point for their campaign. I was told at this stage they have no incentive to back down, but the repercussions are severe because the EU at this point is divided, and Ukraine, as you saw yesterday, doesn't have the sanctions and they don't have the money.
So what does that mean for these emergency talks taking place today, Anne Maria?
There are emergency talks happening today. This is at a technical level. Of course, there's this idea that ultimately this is going to be resolved as a political level, if it can be resolved, because it's become such a political issue too. You saw the Ukrainians saying we have the satellite images to prove that it was Russia. The Hungarians, I'm told, they insist the damage was not caused in the strike. The pipeline is operational, and there was a fire, yes, but it affected a container, not really the pipeline, so the oil can flow. At this stage, the question is whether other countries like Croatia has been floated to could step in, but obviously that's a big question mark, and it's an if. And then, of course, there's this idea that until the oil flow resumes, right, and it's got to be Russian oil, because the Hungarians insist they do not want to pay for other crude because it's the cheaper one. But again, this is a technical question at the stage, and as it stands, it's very unclear to see what the fix can be. The Hungarians have no incentive to back down, and the Ukrainians say this is not a priority at the stage because we didn't break it.
Okay, whatever happens, we will, of course, report it here on Euronews. Maria Tadeo, our EU News editor, thank you so much for keeping across that story for us. And you can read more about that story, about how Hungary hijacked Brussels with their double veto, leaving Ukraine in limbo, on Euronews.com. But that does bring this edition of Europe Today to an end. Thank you so much for your company. As always, take care and see you very soon here on Euronews.
Euronews is on the road to green. We're travelling across Europe to witness solutions to the environmental challenges we all face. Zero